Good afternoon. My name is Christine Neuhold, and I'm going to act as pro-rector for this ceremony. Our rector, Pamela Habovich, cannot be here today, but she sends her regards. So, hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Cecilia Schenetti will defend the academic thesis entitled Creating and Contesting the Message, the life cycle of EU migration information campaigns from Europe to Senegal. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Highly esteemed Pro-Rector and committee members, dear supervisors, colleagues, family and friends. It is a pleasure to share with you the main results of my dissertation titled Creating and Contesting the Message, the Life Cycle of European Migration Information Campaigns from Europe to Senegal. Several European governments invest in so-called migration information campaigns to reduce irregular migration to Europe. In this defense, I will refer to these campaigns as MICs. The main assumption behind MICs is that people in migrant-sending countries do not fully know the risk and the regulations of migration, and that if they were better informed, they would reconsider or even abandon their plans to move without the proper documents. Therefore, MICs are used to persuade specific populations to behave in ways European states consider desirable, and this is what makes MICs soft power tools of governance. Previous research shows that MICs aim to shape the aspirations of so-called potential migrants in order to deter unwanted migration to Europe. At the same time, European governments say that MICs provide information to prevent potential migrants from risking their lives on dangerous migration journeys. So MICs are funded by European states or by the European Commission. International or non-governmental organizations as well as private companies are the implementers of MICs, meaning they carry out campaigns in targeted countries, and young people who aspire to migrate, identified as so-called potential migrants, are the main target of campaign messages. The messages that MIC disseminate are about the risks and dangers that migrants may face when they travel through the desert or across the sea. Messages are also about the difficulties of living undocumented in Europe and about the opportunities that people can find if they stay in their country of origin. So these messages are spread through a wide range of communication tools, such as traditional print media, online multimedia platforms, as well as in-person activities such as theater plays, film screenings, community workshops, and others. The Netherlands and Senegal make an interesting case for the study of MICs. The Dutch government invests substantially in MICs abroad, including in West Africa, and Senegal is often targeted by MICs because it's a departure point to Europe and because it's a key partner in EU-Africa migration governance. In my case study, I observed that MICs involve many actors, and these actors hold different, often contrasting and even critical views about MICs and their messages. For example, Dan is a Dutch policymaker responsible for allocating funds to MICs. In an interview I had with him, he said, MICs are not effective at stopping people from migrating. Hamid is a young Senegalese man working for an international organization to implement MICs in Senegal. When I met Hamid during a campaign event he helped organizing, he told me there isn't one clear message that campaigns promote. He thinks that his work as a local implementer is about creating occasions for the local community to engage in meaningful discussions. Campaign events that I attended in Senegal were often pleasant occasions. People could gather and engage in what seemed recreational activities. But at the same events, participants also share deeply emotional stories and they raise their concerns. Like Rama, a young Senegalese woman who, during a discussion at a campaign event, She said, "How can you stay here and do nothing? How can you look at your parents who need your help to survive?" So why does Dan continue to promote MICs if he thinks that they are not effective? What does it mean for Hamed that campaigns are meaningful moments? And what does Rama's expression aim to convey? Essentially, these observations made me wonder why and how MICs continue to exist, and how different views on MICs can coexist within and between groups of actors that campaigns involve. In my thesis, I examine how campaigns are justified by European funders, how they are put into practice by Senegalese implementers, and how they are experienced by the young people they target in Senegal. My research was driven by the question, how are MICs imagined, implemented, and received by European and Senegalese actors in the Netherlands and Senegal? I analyzed what I call the life cycle of MICs, namely the three phases through which a migration campaign comes into existence, progresses, and reaches its endpoint. And I call these ideation, implementation, and reception. For each of these phases, I focus on the perspective of one specific group of actors. I use the concept of imaginaries to analyze the perspectives of campaign initiators, the concept of speech act to analyze the work of local implementers, and the concept of emotions to analyze the reactions of campaign receivers. I used a multi-sited research design which allowed me to follow campaigns from the Netherlands to Senegal. I conducted qualitative interviews and 15 months of ethnographic fieldwork in Senegal, during which I follow 16 MICs. This means in practice that I participated in numerous campaign events, and I observed how these events were organized and experienced by their multiple implementers and participants. I engaged with three groups of research participants. The first group is the campaign initiators, namely Dutch policymakers and European development workers based in Senegal and Netherlands, who were responsible for allocating funds and developing campaign strategy. The second group consists of Senegalese campaign implementers, whose work was to organize and coordinate campaigns on the ground. And the third group is the campaign receivers, namely Senegalese youth targeted by campaigns, including returned migrants, artists, spectators, and high school students. I will now move to the three empirical chapters of my thesis, each of which zooms into a specific phase of the campaign's life cycle and considers the perspectives of a specific group of actors. In the first empirical chapter, I focus on the ideation phase, and I analyze the justifications that campaign initiators, including policymakers and development workers, provide for funding MICs. Campaign initiators justify MICs in three ways. First, they believe they have a moral duty to inform others. Second, they claim that MICs do no harm. And third, they believe that MICs have a positive impact. Initiators imagine that MICs are harmless, necessary educational initiatives that can empower people. So they see MICs as a tool to promote humanitarian values. But at the same time, they also know that people continue to embark on dangerous migration journeys, even when they are fully informed, because they don't have access to safer migration pathways. So initiators themselves criticize MICs' ineffectiveness and are aware of the underlying injustice. I argue that initiators hold contradictory imaginaries of themselves, of MICs, of the context in which those are produced and received, and of so-called potential migrants. Through their justifications, initiators attempt to reconcile their conflicting imaginaries. They try to make sense of their own position and of a policy that they believe serves both to protect people and to control borders. So despite their criticisms, their justifications keep campaigns going and disguise care to achieve control. The second empirical chapter focuses on the implementation phase. It explores the paradoxical role of Senegalese implementers who seem to spread messages aimed at limiting their own as well as their peers' mobility. I analyze the translation work that implementers do to turn campaign policy into practice. My analysis shows that local implementers act in accordance with contradictory interests. First, they play the game by behaving as expected of them, and in this way, they endorse campaign objectives, they gain economically, and they advance professionally. At the same time, they manifest subtle forms of resistance through the strategic choices that they make in how to carry out campaigns. Their choices help to create spaces for alternative messages to emerge, messages that condemn campaign inadequacy and bring local perspectives to the forefront. Campaign instructions remain somehow vague, and campaign projects clash with the context in which they are implemented. So Senegalese implementers use this vagueness and tension to enact, transform, and contest MICs. So finally, their work sustains global migration regimes and simultaneously enhances local struggles for change. In the third empirical chapter, I focus on the reception phase. I investigate how MICs are received by analyzing the reactions of young Senegalese people who attend campaign events. I show the emotional burden that MICs impose on their recipients by expecting people to reenact, to narrate, and to listen to traumatic stories in an apparently festive environment. An emotional burden is also placed on participants through moralizing narratives and the silencing of critical voices. This burden reveals the emotional violence of MICs. Participation in migration campaigns makes people sick, sad, distressed, and angry. Participants are placed in uncomfortable situations, and their concerns are often dismissed or disguised. Secondly, youth at campaign events use an effective register to address their precarious conditions and their social immobility, and to express resistance to the power structure that constrain their mobility. So the significant emotional labor the Senegalese youth bear during campaign events highlight their demands for social justice. So while campaigns produce emotionally violent effects, campaign receivers try to push back this violence by conveying messages of protest that point out the hypocrisy of MICs and demand structural changes in the name of social justice. To conclude, by employing a life cycle approach and a multi-sited ethnographic research design, my thesis contributes to the study of MICs in the following ways. First, it explains the work necessary for MICs to exist. And I have shown that this work involves imagination, translation, and emotion. This work is carried out by multiple actors across different campaign stages. Second, I showed how MICs place different actors in ambiguous positions, and these positions allow contradictory messages and interpretations to coexist within individuals. This reveals the tension behind how these campaigns are conceived, the conflicting interests driving their implementation, and the mixed emotional responses that they create. Thirdly, my thesis shows that those who conceive, implement, and receive campaigns simultaneously endorse and contest them. This makes MICs messy, dynamic, unpredictable, and often contradictory phenomena, both in practice and in their emotional impact. Lastly, while MICs may seem harmless, they fail to address the concerns of the very people that they claim to benefit, and instead they produce violent effects on them. I thank you for the attention, and I now give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you so much for your very clear presentation, and the opposition will now be opened by Professor Sophie van Honacker, who holds a chair in Administrative Governance at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences.
Thank you very much, Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Cecilia, well, first of all, congratulations with this very innovative and also well-written PhD. I really enjoyed reading it. You deal with a highly topical issue, and I very much appreciate also your choice for this multi-sided research design, looking at actors both in the Netherlands as well in Senegal. And I think also your vignettes are very helpful to get the reader a real feel for what is happening on the ground and a sense of the developments in the field. And last but not least, I think you also raise very interesting ethical questions. And this invited me also to further reflection. This being said, I also have a question for you. So you clearly explained now these different phases of the MICs. And so for the first phase of the life cycle of the mix, you have looked into the case of the Netherlands. And so Dutch policymakers are, however, not the only ones in Europe who deal with disinformation campaigns, and you were also referring to the Commission, to other member states. But I'm wondering, during your research, did the interviews refer also to the European context, to the EU, to Brussels, to your European policy frames? Did they also refer to practices by other member states? Or were they more or less operating from their own bubble, let's say, and acting in splendid isolation? So I would like to hear a little bit more because the Dutch, you only, unfortunately, of course, could only look at one country. But I would like to hear a little bit more to what extent, even if this was not your research, to what extent you saw also some interaction with other member states, with the European Commission or other EU actors.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your compliment and for your question. So I think the case of the Netherlands is a compelling case exactly because the Dutch policymakers want to bring the discussion about campaigns within the European context. And in fact, what happened was that under the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs came up with the suggestion of making an information group at the European level, an awareness-raising info group, where different policymakers from different member states, as well as practitioners, could come together to share practices and to share the kind of knowledge and experiences that they have made in the making of this campaign. And I think the Dutch state has been very active, not only in funding campaigns abroad, but in also bringing the reflection forward within the European community, let's say. So this is also what one of my respondents said in an interview. She said, Carleen, a policymaker from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, she said that she was the chair of this info group, and for her the importance of that group was not only to share knowledge, but was also to find a way to harmonize the message at the EU level. So how do we do that? Because of course there are also different kind of approaches that states had in how to communicate messages through campaigns. And for this policymaker specifically, it was important to harmonize the message and to position themselves as Europe rather than individual member states. And that's also why they started a conversation about how can we do campaigns collaborative. And for her, this was seen as a big challenge because, in fact, some member states were maybe more focused on targeting specific people, for example, in the countries where campaigns were implemented. So I think that's where they needed to find a way to strategize about it. That was the approach. But I think the initiative came from the Netherlands, and I think this was also what made it a compelling case for me, because it showed that policymakers within the Dutch state had already developed some kind of criticism and some kind of what they consider a best practice of what they consider not to replicate when it came to make campaigns.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope the info group will also read your book, actually.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Papasako, Laboratory of Human Geography, University Cheikh Anta Diop in Senegal, and he will ask his question in French, but Cecilia will, of course, answer in English.
Thank you, President. Donc, merci. Donc, je vais m'adresser à Cecilia en français pour lui dire toutes mes félicitations pour ce travail accompli et la présentation claire qui a été faite des principaux résultats. Maintenant, je me situe dans la perspective. Et dans cette perspective, la question est que vous évoquez les migrants de retour comme cible donc des campagnes. Alors, la question c'est comment interprétez-vous cette notion de migrants de retour dans les discours des différentes parties prenantes donc des campagnes donc de sensibilisation. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup, and I will try to translate this and paraphrase your very pertinent question. So the question is, how do you, also having been part of the field, how do you appreciate the notion, appreciate the notion of return migrants in the discourse of the stakeholders, the different parties who took part in this debate? Was the question clear to you?
Yeah. Highly esteemed opponent, merci beaucoup pour votre question, Joseph. I'm going to answer in English, if that's fine. So it's an interesting question because, in fact, what I saw, specifically in the campaign Migrants as Messenger, was that the way the IOM, so the International Organization for Migration, was the implementing organization implementing the campaign Migrants as Messenger in Senegal as well as in other West African countries. And they were using the term return migrant in a specific way, which is not necessarily how the literature speaks about return migrants. And so the way that they defined return migrants, it was to indicate people, Senegalese citizens, who were returned by the IOM. So some of them were returned by the IOM, but some of them were actually intercepted on their way to migrate. And they bring all of them together and they call them return migrants, and they made them so-called volunteers of the campaign Migrants as Messenger. And they kind of, I think what the IOM did in that campaign was to label people under this category of return migrants, with giving them the characteristics of those who know the risk because they've gone through it, but they've actually failed, let's say, because they were returned. And so this position of returnees who were people who were returned by the IOM, according to the institution, to the organization, it would put them in a position of being heard by their peers because they've gone through the risk of irregular migration. And so in that sense, the Migrants as Messenger campaign was based on a notion of returnees as having failed and having been returned by the organization, and having also, and being put in that position within the campaign to actually find a new space within their community. Of course, this was a very complex and manipulative way of putting people in this place. But I think this is the kind of definition that the campaign gave to return migrants. And what was interesting to see in that specific campaign was that at one point I also found out that not only some people were returned by the IOM and others were intercepted, but there were also others who actually never really moved, but were engaged in the campaign anyway. So this is also that there was a lot of misuse of this terminology of return migrant. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you.
The opposition will now be continued by Professor Dr. Antoine Bécaud online, Professor of Sociology, Université Sorbonne, Paris Nord.
Thank you, Mrs. President. I apologize for being online. I'm very happy, nevertheless, to be here with you. I thought that you found your thesis to be very short, efficient, and impactful, extremely clearly organized and structured, so it made it very easy and pleasant to read, and the argument was compelling and convincing. I have a first question, which points to the fact that on the one hand, you stress the fact that policymakers in the Netherlands justify their own campaigns, their own work, by arguing that it does no harm, which indeed is a standard way of presenting information campaigns. It's something that merely provides information and cannot therefore hurt the people who receive this information. And then in the chapter on the reception of campaigns in Senegal, you stress the fact that these different events at which the messages of the campaigns are vehicled among the local population, these generate situations of emotional situations in which people express lots of tensions and stress and highly emotional feelings. I was therefore wondering whether we could see this stress or emotional feelings as a kind of harm, because the messages by the campaign sort of raise painful issues among the audience. And I was therefore wondering whether the do no harm argument of policymakers would hold, if you juxtapose it with the actual impact of the campaigns. And sort of the side question here is, how is this sort of painful or impactful dimension of the campaigns hidden in the eyes of the policymakers, who manage to develop or maintain a kind of technocratic attitude according to which information is neutral and should never be considered as harmful to the people who receive the information, even though you clearly show that it might be the case, and there's no wonder to that, because indeed migration raises fundamental issues, emotional issues, losses, migrant death, and so on, and local population can easily be hurt by the messages surrounding migration. Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, so if I understand your question correctly, you're asking me about how initiators understand their justification of doing no harm compared to the actual effect of doing harm that people experience. Am I correct? Okay. So I think the justification of doing no harm come from a perspective of campaign initiators having to protect themselves, to also make sense of what they do. And I think what they do is basically to have a sort of evaluation considering the options that they have. So the argument of doing no harm, it was told to me by several respondents, it was because it could be worse, because this is better than investing in policies that actually do physical harm that is very obvious, such as hard measures of bordering and control and militarized interventions. So within that kind of context that they have to deal with, campaigns are easy to justify in that way, because there's no such a evident physical violence, and the campaigns are not based on coercion. So I think this helps to still feel like we are doing some forms of control, but that we are also doing our best. And I think this justification is what makes it acceptable for people to continue investing in this policy and to continue funding campaigns, because actually, if we consider the other options, that would be worst. So I think seeing in that positive light, it also helps ones to feel okay and to protect oneself from the dark side of one's job. Yeah, I think this is what I could think of.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Cecilia Schenetti, Assistant Professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam.
Thank you. Dear Cecilia, first of all, I really want to congratulate you for a wonderful dissertation. Beautifully written, and also it unpacks these migration information campaigns, bringing to surface the complexities that are caught within them in a beautiful way. Your thesis clearly shows that you have a very strong ethnographic sensibility, particularly in how you navigated multi-sited fieldwork, and throughout your thesis you reflect on your own positionality, what it means for you to be in these different situations with these different stakeholders. And in your methodology chapter, you describe some moments of improvisation and emotional entanglement during campaign events. And one of the strengths of ethnography as an approach to research lies in its ability to embrace these moments and be able to respond to unexpected situations. So how did this, you having to respond to unexpected situations, shape your understanding of migration information campaigns? And what does this tell us? This is a sort of second part of the question. What does this tell us about the value of unpredictability when ethnography as an approach to research is used to research policy instruments? So the first part of the question is, how did responding to the unexpected in the field, if I can think of examples from your thesis like disruptions during caravan tours, or critical voices that were expressed in school settings, how did these sort of unexpected situations that you faced shape your understanding of migration information campaigns? And what does the ability of ethnography to respond to the unexpected tell us about the value of unpredictability when you are using it to evaluate policy instruments?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your compliments and for your question about methodology. And so first of all, I love doing ethnography, and I think it keeps on challenging me in a way that also makes me wanting to understand these questions better, exactly like unpredictability, because sometimes you just do things because you follow your instinct, and then you need to retrace back where that instinct came from, right? So I think this is what I find very magic in ethnography. I think a moment of unexpected situation that really helped me to understand better campaigns was questioning my emotional dissonance, was questioning my feeling of uncomfortness and my feeling of not knowing exactly what I was supposed to feel. Because following these campaigns, as I mentioned in my presentation, it was often a fun time. It was often a moment of recreational activities where I could also just bond with young people by painting a wall. And so that communicated me some feelings that demanded a bit of digging, and I had to sit with that feeling of being entertained by a campaign to actually understand what it could communicate to me and how I could exploit that to actually understand something about campaigns. And so I think questioning my emotional dissonance helped me to pay attention to my bodily reactions, and that, as a consequence, helped me to pay attention to bodily reactions of others. Because if I felt unsettled, then maybe people who are experiencing the same kind of social space might also feel unsettled. And I think this was key, because paying attention to bodies of others also helped me to notice those moments of ruptures, for example. So the moment when Kumba, for example, decided not to perform anymore, or where someone suddenly decided to leave the space of a campaign. So paying attention to the physical, to the bodily presence of people and the bodily performance helped me to notice these things, which eventually led me to highlight themes like emotional burden, emotional violence within my data. When it comes to the ability of of ethnographers to capture these unexpected moments and to communicate this to policy. I think this is a big challenge. But I think in my PhD time, I had the chance to talk with policymakers, and the first thing that I would have as a response was actually that that people really appreciate ethnographic research because it's full of stories and it's full of tiny details and anecdotes and things that just seem anecdotes, that they're actually telling a lot about a specific context and phenomena and things that we study. So I think, especially I'm thinking now of this State of the Art conference that I attended that was organized by the Dutch ministry. I had a lot of positive answers in positive reactions by people who would say we need to understand this, we need to use these ethnographic methods more. But the whole conversation was about, but actually we also need to measure things in certain kind of parameters that we have that are based on ways of understanding policies that also consider a lot output and input and measurable things. So at the end, the conclusion was we are looking at different things, using different methods, and coming to different kind of suggestions as well. But the first, I think it was good. I think it was a positive thing to see how within policy making there's also this curiosity towards hearing from ethnographic researchers.
I am very satisfied with this answer.
Thank you so much. And the opposition will now be continued by Dr. Talita Dubois, assistant professor within the migration group at UNU Merit, also at Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, thank you for offering us this very holistic and rich account, which I am glad to have had the opportunity to read, so let me add my congratulations. I understand, of course, that you did not set out to evaluate migration information campaigns, but obviously your findings sit out there with a growing body of evaluative evidence, and I wanted to ask you about how your findings speak to evaluative studies. And building on your discussion with Dr. Schenetti, I wondered, okay, if we assume that migration information campaigns will continue to be funded and that they will also continue to be evaluated, what would you say researchers should take into account based on your work in designing future studies and in interpreting their data?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your compliments and for your questions. So the first part of your question is about how my work speaks to evaluation studies. And I think the way it speaks to it is that I highlight effects that campaigns produce that are not considered in evaluation studies. So the whole point about non-material and less visible forms of effect that campaigns produce, especially by producing violence to their participants, these are things that are not captured in any way within evaluation studies. But I think this is also connected to the work of local implementers, for example, and how they do this form of border work that is made of very invisible gesture, but that is also a very tense kind of space. And there's no evaluation study that looks at that, but I think I wouldn't call it an evaluation study per se, but I would think that future studies could have a broader view on campaigns where all these different layers that also remain more hidden, that are also about effects on people, but not only in that moment, but also what happens after a campaign has passed and someone has to deal with that emotional burden, right? Like how this affects social context and relationship and how people understand their identities and their possibilities. So I think there is a list of effects that are not considered here. And I think what I got to be a bit skeptical about these evaluation studies that were actually very much based on a spot kind of calculation where people would just be asked like, okay, do you want to migrate now, immediately after taking part of this campaign? And I don't think that tells much actually, because that is also the kind of like quick emotionality that campaigns want to play with because that's also the reaction that you get from people in that sense. Like some of the participants would also say, yeah, now I'm scared, I don't want to go anymore. But what does this tell us really about how this answer is understood within their broader context and their broader life and life trajectories and identities? So I think when it comes to design future ways of evaluating campaigns, all these more hidden aspects could also be paid attention to.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're doing super well. We have time for a second round. And this second round will be started by Professor Sacco.
Merci, Présidente. Merci pour ces réponses à Cecilia. Alors, la deuxième question, c'est relatif à votre expérience de terrain. Vous avez passé plusieurs années sur le terrain, vous avez conduit votre recherche peut-être avec des performances, mais aussi avec des aspects que vous n'avez pas pu apprécier. La question est, quel conseil donneriez-vous à un chercheur, une chercheuse du Nord qui vient en Afrique sur le terrain de la recherche sur les migrations, à partir de votre expérience? Merci.
I know you understand, but I will still translate also for the audience. So with your ample experience of the field, Cecilia, as we've just heard, has been in Senegal on the ground doing ample research. How would you then advise or guide a future researcher or even PhD candidate from the global north who's setting out on similar endeavors? Je bien traduit? Oui? Okay.
Highly esteemed opponent, merci beaucoup. So I think there's no magic formula of that, but I think what was very useful for me was to stay au Senegal like for a long time, right? So I think my previous experience living in Senegal helped me a lot in navigating a lot of situations I found myself into later on during my fieldwork. So of course, a sort of like pre-knowledge of a few things about the context are helpful, and people can acquire that in different ways. I think study about a space, a place, and a culture could help, but I think what could help is actually just really by being and by listening and by just being open to learn, basically, and also to question your own assumptions constantly, right? I think in my experience, I was very lucky to have found a lot of people around me, including Les Laboratoires, where I could find peers and people who also guide me through questioning my own assumptions, but also guide me through make sense and find new keys of interpretation of situations, of gesture, of emotional reactions, of a variety of observable instances. And so for me, it was essential. I would have not been able to do such a fieldwork without also all this kind of support that I found and that I try to make for myself as well. This, of course, demands a lot of patience. It demands a lot of courage also to ask, and it demands a lot of self-reflection. I think what also helped me a lot was that because of this work, I had to write, right? I have to take notes. So that was for me a moment to also elaborate on these questions and to then bring up these reflections in conversations with people. So I think this is what I would suggest for other students.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And the opposition will now be continued by Professor Pecot. Is he here?
Yes, I am. Thank you for giving the floor for a second time. I would like to perhaps address the issue of contradictions within the policy which you highlight in your thesis. You argue indeed that these information campaigns are full of contradictions. So I was wondering whether these contradictions are inherent to any kind of policy, in which case there would be nothing specific about information campaigns, or whether these contradictions were necessary to navigate between the different interests and viewpoints of the different stakeholders which are involved, in the sense that information campaigns are usually organized and funded by the Global North, like the Netherlands, but implemented the Global South, like in Senegal. And therefore, in order to connect these two countries, which have very different worldviews and positions in terms of immigration policy, you need to some extent to design information campaigns or policy instruments which are inherently contradictory, so to say. And I was wondering whether we could extrapolate from that to reflect on what could be called global migration governance, namely the fact that states could multilaterally discuss and govern migration, and the extent to which this type of approach in terms of global migration governance makes it necessary to design policies that are contradictory, precisely to address the concerns of the different states which are involved, as well as other actors like civil society. Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. I think at the end what my thesis shows is that these contradictions are exactly what make campaigns going, because people who are in different positions and who have different tasks can find different ways to make it acceptable, and can find different ways to exploit that position to say different things and to push different messages. So at the end, I think campaigns are designed to be contradictory, and the contradictions is what, multiple contradictions are what makes them thriving and makes them able to continue. And I think this, the case of campaigns is just one case of a policy, right, which is more of a soft form of creating borders, and that fits within a broader range of policies that states have to create, to make control, to do control, to control and govern migration. And I think it could be interesting to see how other forms of policy that are about controlling migration are in fact based on the same forms of contradictions, because I think within these contradictions, that's where actually the resistance and the protests come in, right? And the more we do that, the more push for this resistance, the more space resistance and protest might find. I think this is exactly what is happening in Senegal, where a group of activists and or civil society groups actually saw how these campaigns are so contradictory and don't make any sense, and they try to find another way of doing it. So I think it makes sense to look at contradictions within a broader global migration governance, because that's where we can also see how alternatives are pushed forward, and whenever the conditions would allow for these alternatives to emerge and to develop, that maybe then something will happen. I hope I answer your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And the opposition will now be continued by Dr. Schenetti.
I'm building a bridge from the last question and last answer. So in your analysis, you conceptualize local implements of return campaigns as brokers who are simultaneously reproducing and contesting these campaigns. And you interpret their actions through the lens of performative speech acts. However, if we zoom out from your case study, I believe that these performative speech acts, or what you're observing, resonates with broader scholarship on border work, which describes border work, the making and unmaking of borders, as a process that is very messy, because the border is a space in which opposing or different forces meet with each other. So how does your ethnography of Senegalese implementers refine or challenge this notion of messy border work? And what I'm trying to get to here is that this goes beyond the policies, right? There are many more actors involved than just the policies or the policymakers. So how does your ethnography refine this notion of messy border work in which multiple parties are sort of co-creating or co-contesting borders?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question, which ties very well with your work on border work. I think my thesis, especially in chapter 4, where I look at brokers as being border workers, I identify this new group of border workers as the implementers of campaigns. And I think this can help us to see how border work is something that not only happens because it's done by citizens. I think this has been said by other studies, but it's also something that happens as an everyday form of practice in intermediation phases of campaign policy. And I think we can also understand better the concept of border work through the experiences of brokers, because while border work has been conceptualized as practical and discursive labor that people do that produce and erase borders, I think the brokers here, the local implementers, also show how this border work is very often invisible and is very often made of silence and is not per se practical or discursive labor. So I think this can enrich our notion of border work, and that's also why the concept of speech act is relevant here, because it allows us to see this hidden part as well.
Thank you.
The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Dubo.
Okay, so shifting from chapter 4 to chapter 5, because if I understand correctly, in chapter 4 you discuss you analyze how these brokers, these implementers, who, if I understand correctly, are those directly responsible for implementing the campaigns and are in that capacity accountable to the funders and commissioners. And you discuss how they discuss and justify their own involvement in implementing these campaigns. And then in chapter 5, you discuss the effective responses of who you referred to in your presentation as the recipients. But those recipients also include people also involved less directly in the implementation, so the artists, the volunteers, the return migrants, and other participants, and how they respond to the campaigns. And my question is, how do these effective responses relate to the volunteers, the artists, the return migrants, the participants' motivations and expectations to participate and expectations of their involvement?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question, which allows me to elaborate a bit more on the experiences of the volunteers, for example, or the artists. And I think there's a lot more work that there's a lot yeah, I could have written much more about them, let's say. So when it gets to their motivations, I think if we take the case of, again, of the Migrants as Messenger campaign, volunteers, they receive an economic allowance, which is very limited, but very often it's the starting point. It's something that might motivate people to embark on these projects. And at the same time, they might see their participation as an opportunity to develop certain skills and to develop certain connections. This also comes from the expectations of getting something out of it, as, for example, in terms of professional development. So this is the case of Anna, for example, one of my respondents who I met one time, and I helped her preparing her CV, and her CV was all based on activities that she has done as a volunteer within this Migrants as Messenger campaign with the IOM. So she was really trying to translate the workshops that she participated and the training that she received as being part of this campaign. She was trying to translate that into something that would define her professional figure. At the same time, people might see the space of a campaign as a space to free their mind and to do something new and to do something creative as well. This is what, for example, Umi, one of my participants, told me during a graffiti event by saying that it's fun because you forget about your problems. But I think the main motivation is also that people want to speak up and they want to denounce the violence that they have experienced. So that's where the affective element comes in, because many of these volunteers that I observed and I got to know, they were very often very frustrated by how the campaign worked and by how their work was actually being exploited and how their experiences and voices were also being exploited by the campaign to produce certain kind of effect and to have specific kind of goals. But within that, they also wanted to tell their own truth. They also wanted to say that we should have the right to move in normal conditions. This is what someone told me. And therefore, that becomes a motivation to be part of this project. Now, whether like that, I think that they contribute greatly to make this campaign, but they also suffer a lot from it. So I think it's something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about motivations and when we talk about how much of an opportunity this space can be for them, because actually it comes with high cost.
It is almost 2 o'clock, so the pedal will come in any moment, but I will still give Professor van Honacker the opportunity to kick off her question. And then you can debate after.
I'll speak very slowly.
Now I want to answer it.
I think if you look also at the elections in the Netherlands, you see that the issue of migration continues to be very high on the political agenda. And your research also shows that the impact of and the effectiveness of MICs to influence the beliefs and the behaviors of potential migrants is questionable.
Thank you so much, and this is something to be discussed later. But now, Cecilia Schenetti, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and of your defense today. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room. Cecilia Schenetti, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Congratulations. We still have to continue with some ceremonial issues. Professor Matsukato is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I now invite your supervisor to take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
Then by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Cecilia Schenetti, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Dr. Schenetti. Dear Cecilia, now you know this is actually the second laudatio that I do for you.
Yes.
Because we go back a long way to November 2016 when you were a student in the MAGDS course on transnational migrant networks and flows. And I recall you as this shy but engaged student who clearly thought about what she read. Later that academic year, you asked me to supervise your master's thesis on young refugees and asylum seekers in Maastricht. And you carefully read through all of the academic literature, but your heart was in the reality of these asylum seekers. And I recall how you struggled between their reality and academia, which for you sometimes just felt too far removed from these daily lived realities that you so passionately wanted to make a difference in. And this passion resulted in such a good master's thesis, full of rich interviews and observations with a population that's difficult to reach. But you were also tentative, often doubting about whether you had enough data and whether it was good enough to fairly represent the youth who you had befriended. And I quote from my laudatio of 2017, I would say that part of my work as your supervisor was to make you realize what precious material you had in your hands. For you, it was almost natural to have this information, but it wasn't natural. It was a lot of hard work. So the quality of your fieldwork is why when FASOS won the European Commission-funded co-fund grant entitled The Hardening and Softening of Borders, or LIMES for short, which was co-led by the chair of your assessment committee, Professor Sophie van Honacker, I immediately thought of you. I had proposed a project on European migration information campaigns in Senegal based on some brainstorming that I did with Dr. Jamila Schans of the Research Data Center that falls under the Dutch Ministry of Security and Justice. And I contacted you to alert you to this vacancy. And again, you were tentative. You had just been working for an Italian NGO in Senegal. Did you really want to go back to academia? And would you be able to do it? And would it feel too far removed from anything practical? And so on and so forth. Now, I'm not sure what made you decide to apply. Maybe I prodded a little bit, but you did, and you got the position, and boy, am I glad that you did. Your PhD thesis is an amazing piece of work precisely because of your passion, your dedication, your stamina, and love for your field site and the people that you met. A reader feels it in reading your thesis thanks to the richness of your data, not to mention the beautiful photographs that evoke the many forms that MICs take. You navigated a difficult field because MICs in Senegal are everywhere, and everyone seems to have a public discourse on them, but also a lot of private feelings. You think deeply about academic literature. In fact, we, as a supervisory team, quickly learned that if you would send us a draft of, say, 10 pages, we actually had to read 20 pages because your drafts were full of comments in the margins, referring to another book or concept that could be used here, or new MIC that you discovered there, or an additional quote that you could use here, or why this point that you're making could be made otherwise, and on and on. Your comments in the margins were as long as the draft itself. Again, showing on the one hand, your tentative nature, but also the profound reading that you did of a variety of theories and concepts coming from different academic fields. And we were all quickly impressed with the quality of your fieldwork. People shared highly intimate thoughts and feelings with you, and the honesty and respect with which you approached people permeates the pages of your thesis. What makes your thesis so original is your inclusion of the whole chain of actors that make MICs, so that you're able to make us better understand why, despite all the contradictions, or maybe because of all the contradictions of MICs and the differences in perspective of the actors involved, MICs continue to persist. Through a nuanced and refined analysis, you show us the faces behind policymakers who often get lumped in one category, yet you show the internal conflicts that they face and how they may be skeptical, but also how they deal with this cognitive dissonance between appealing to notions of care and humanitarianism when describing why they continue to finance and develop MICs. And you also ably show the contradictions of the people on the ground who enact MICs in Senegal, from the EU representatives to the international and local NGOs and the returnees who are all engaged in MICs. And finally, in what I believe to be the most insightful and critical chapter, you show how MICs, although thought to be harmless, can also have emotional tolls for many of the actors involved, including their audiences. And this has been an invisible aspect of MICs, not often talked about, but which you so poignantly bring forth through the voices of the youth themselves, who are caught between a rock and a hard place, between a country with high unemployment and a government that has not addressed inequalities, the social pressures on them to become adults, but with no way to do so, and migration as the only way to build a future for themselves, but which is made impossible for them. As the title of the poem of the two secondary school students that you included in the thesis so evocatively explains, they have a life without a life. Cecilia, I must admit, at a certain point, I really wondered if you were going to come back. You loved life in Senegal, even if at times it might have been hard and emotionally draining. You made real friendships and had difficulty returning to our individualistic society where every person is for themselves. You envisaged communal living like that which you experienced in Senegal, but thankfully you did come back. And I know that you found great support in your friends and your family, your father, your mother, and brothers from Modena. You wrote a beautiful thesis on your own time, and that's another thing that I learned about you. You do not like to be rushed. You seem to have appreciated the PhD and treated it as a chance to dedicate yourself to a topic, enjoying the reading and thinking and writing. And I'm sure there were difficult moments, but overall, you are someone who takes the time also for other things in life, such as your friends and the political, how you dedicated yourself to the pro-Palestinian protests, engaged with projects in Senegal to make unheard voices heard. And of course, now you have plans to go back to Senegal. These are wonderful traits that will serve you well in the future. Cecilia, it has been such a pleasure to be on this journey with you for almost a decade. I know that I can speak on behalf of Professor Wyatt and Dr. Schans, your co-supervisors, and on their behalf when I say that you can be proud of what you have produced and what you have achieved today. Sally, Jamila, I also want to thank you both for the stimulating and fun meetings. We came from different fields. We come from different fields. We're not past tense yet. We come from different fields and learned from each other. And we sprinkled our meetings with a good dose of humor. For me, this is academics at its best. In my experience, we were the dream team of co-supervisors.
I brought it.
Okay, Cecilia also mentioned
Also for
it.
me.
Cecilia, I wish you well in your future pursuits and truly hope that our paths will keep on crossing. In bocca al lupo.
What an applause, dear Dr. Schenetti. Also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. With this crowd, I think it will be a very nice celebration. Before we go outside and party, we will still take a picture with the new doctor here and our online guest, and then we will take a picture on the stairs. Family, don't go away. We still take a picture on the stairs. And then we go to your reception. So, congratulations and enjoy today.
Thank you. Take your diploma. Take your diploma.